Okay. That'll let me see everybody. Good afternoon. As I was just saying, we are recording today's session about the Emergency Solutions Grant Program application. The information that we're going to present today is going to be covered also in the request for proposal materials that are available on the IHCDA website. But we'll go ahead and get started, being mindful of time. And if we have any folks join us late, that's fine. We will let them in as we need to. Mute my phone. Don't need that distraction, do we? Okay, so we're going to spend some time today overviewing the Emergency Solutions Grant Program, very briefly hitting on a couple of key components related to eligibility for funding, an overview of the application, and some brief discussion on program areas, and then a time for questions. I anticipate us having more than enough time today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that I can. For those of you who have been subrecipients of IHCDA in the past, you may know that my colleague Diane Walker had been the administrator on this program for a number of years, and she has moved on to new opportunities. So I have done my best to get up to speed about ESG in a very short amount of time. I cannot guarantee that I am an expert in everything, but I will do my best to answer questions to the best of my ability and follow up with any of you who have something specific you'd like to ask. The intention of this is to be a pretty open session for folks who maybe never applied for funding before, all the way through those of you who have applied in the past. So I apologize if some of this is a little bit redundant or unnecessary to you, but there are some folks out there who may be online now or viewing the session later that would like to know some of the information we're going to cover. And like I said, we will go over the program components, but not in a ton of detail, more on the eligibility of your programs and whether or not they would be applicable for funding than on, the nitty gritty of implementation. So first, I just want to make clear that there are some minimum requirements for eligibility and funding under the Emergency Solutions Grant or ESG program. The organizational structure, your policies and practices within the agency, all those things come into play on whether or not you are eligible to apply. Those of you who have been past recipients of this funding from IHCDA may have noticed that we have reduced the number of administrative attachments we're requiring to an application. That's really because as we are looking to streamline our processes, we're trying to avoid duplication of information collection, and we will likely be asking for certain materials from you at a later date, closer to when we would be providing you a grant agreement. So please know that it's not that those requirements have gone away entirely. Some of them we have streamlined, so we are coordinating with our partners through IHCDA if that information has been collected elsewhere, and that we recognize that in some cases we were asking for some things in a duplicate manner, or that we could have collected those at a later date. So first, if you are interested in ESG funding, please know that you need to be a 501c3 organization. You need to be located in the balance of state. That means you cannot be locating your services in Marion County. You need to operate your programs with the practice of Housing First principles. Your organization has to have non-discriminatory policies and practices. And family separation, meaning the separation of individuals who are identified in a family unit, and HUD identifies and defines family to be at the definition of the household. So the household defines who is in their family. It's not just blood relation or people have to be married or anything like that. So family separation is prohibited by HUD, and we will be enforcing that policy in our application process. Under the financial management, please note that this is the administration of federal funds, meaning that there is financial management expectations. Even if they are being administered at the state level, we are required to be in compliance with 2 CFR 200 practices, meaning there is a long list of federal code that we need to make sure our partners who are administering these dollars can maintain. So if you've never seen 2 CFR 200 or don't know what that is, I suggest a quick Google and take a look at it. But generally, we expect people to be using generally acceptable accounting principles when you operate your award and reporting your expenses. You need to have staff and board members within your organization who have responsibilities of managing finances. Within IHTDA, that the way we kind of look at that is that, you don't have the same person opening mail, signing checks, making deposits, that those need to be, uniquely done by individuals, and there is oversight over that process so that there is no financial mismanagement. Grants are all operated on a reimbursement basis. So that means that when you apply, if you, let's say you're applying for $25,000 in outreach, street outreach, you would be claiming those expenses after you incur and pay them. So this is not a situation where you're provided $25,000 upfront and then you can submit reports or anything afterwards. You would be operating on a reimbursement basis. You need to have the capacity within your organization on-time monthly claims, and you need to be able to have 100% match of funds for eligible services on eligible activities, eligible sources on eligible activities. We'll talk a little bit more about match in just a moment. All right, so required commitments or documentation. If you've had the chance to maybe even complete the new application and you've just decided to be here because you wanted to double check, you may have noticed that we have a section here called required commitments and documentation inside our application. We are not requiring attachments for all of these things, but we will be verifying all of these things prior to selecting projects for the amount of funding they're requesting. First, the expectation is that folks will be participating in their regional planning council. We won't be asking you to provide documentation of your attendance. We will be providing the list of applicants from your area to that regional planning council chair, and they'll just go ahead and verify whether or not you've been engaging in those local planning efforts. If you are a new applicant and have not yet participated in the regional planning council, does not strictly prohibit you from receiving funding. It's just going to be that we're going to want to make sure that there is coordination there moving forward. You need to participate in the point time count or the housing inventory chart count when that happens in the winter. If you're not familiar with those terms, a quick Google will let you know what those are, but they happen every year and they are very critical to our reporting processes to HUD. Your organization needs to be able to provide a copy of its registration with the Secretary of State, verifying that you are in fact an entity registered in the state of Indiana as a 501c3. You need to have, as a new applicant, you need to provide the articles of incorporation of your organization to verify that you have board, that you have standing as an entity. We are asking for folks to provide a copy of fidelity bond insurance and general liability insurance to make sure that your agency is adequately insured to take on the responsibility of administering the programs and federal funds. And then you will need to provide your unique entity identifier and a copy of your SAM.gov registration, which can simply be a screenshot of that registration online. And then we'll want to see a match commitment letter or MOUs for your match to verify that you are prepared to meet that 100% match requirement. So really quickly going to hit on match. I'm not going to dive super deep into match because that's really gets pretty in detail. If folks have questions, we'll take those at the end and I'm happy to answer any questions that I can about match. So ESG does have a 100% match requirement, meaning if you apply for $25,000, you need to be able to provide supporting documentation of match for $25,000 when you apply. You need to be able to provide an MOU for services of in-kind support that are eligible for match, or maybe a copy of a letter from a private funder that verifies that you have received private funding for the amount of that full match. Just know that a couple of key things to remember is that there are eligible activities that your match has to be meeting. So just having $25,000 within the organization may or may not qualify for match, because match needs to be funding spent on eligible activities that the grant could pay for, but instead you're using match dollars. So it's not that you could, for example, if you've got a shelter program, but you also have in a clothing pantry program, that you could just report all of your clothing pantry donations as your match. Clothing isn't an eligible expense under ESG, so you would want to make sure that whatever you are matching with is an eligible expense under ESG. Next, you'll want to just note that if you are thinking about using federal funds for match, just please make sure that the federal funds you're using are eligible match. So let's say you receive local ESG funds. ESG can't be matched with ESG, even if you are operating two separate distinct ESG programs. It's the same federal funding source, so we wouldn't want to be reporting that as match. So make sure that you have checked with your funder specifically to see if it's eligible. There are some funders who make a determination that they don't want their funds to be used as match. So it's not a blanket allowable or disallowed match source. It's just whether or not that other source says so. The only thing that's truly unallowable is to use ESG to match for ESG. So if you're not familiar with match, there are two kinds. There's cash match or an in-kind services match, meaning if somebody provided voluntary services for you, that would be in kind. If you are provided a grant from a local United Way, that would be cash. All right, so now I'd like to hit on a few things with new and returning applicant funding. Our requirements at the Balance of State are that new applicants do have a cap on their funding. And this is really just because we know folks when they're new to federal dollars, as some of our new applicants are, there is some preparation, some capacity building, some support commit themselves if they've not received this funding before. So we have these caps to protect the organization and to protect IHCDA from any unnecessary liability to organization applying. Just for folks' awareness, you may or may not know this. So IHCDA received an ESG allocation of about 3.9 million. Many of you on the call today whose names I recognize or organizations I recognize may have also in the past been the recipient of COVID-19 funding. And you may note that 3.9 million as an annual ESG allocation is a lot less than 32 million that the Balance of State received during the COVID-19 funding period. So we anticipate that we are going to have many more requests for funding than we can honor. Our process here is that we will honor all the requests that are eligible as a formula grant, and anybody who is eligible and meets our standards will receive some funding. If you come in as a returning applicant and request $250,000, but we don't have enough money for everybody who's applied who is eligible and can receive funding, then we will right size those requests so that everybody gets an accordance share in accordance with our calculations of the requests that they're making. So there's a couple ways that we do that, how we determine about how much people get. First, that we have caps on funding that can be awarded under each program type in accordance with the Indiana plan. So as a HUD program, ESG operates under the purview of Indiana's CON plan or consolidated plan. And that CON plan is really what directs us as far as how much of a percentage of the total 3.9 million can go to any particular award amount. There's also obviously certain federal restrictions like caps on administrative funds and things like that. Because like I said, we receive more requests for funding than we can honor. We use that CON plan as kind of our initial framework. And then we score and review those applications, and applications with the highest score have the most likely of receiving more of their initial request. Applications with the lowest score are likely to receive less of their initial request. So if our application is 100 points and you apply for $100,000 and you score 90 points, it's more likely that you're going to get close to $100,000 than the applicant who maybe scored 25 points. That's the way our formula works, but it is a formula grant. So if you apply and you are eligible, we will try to do our best to honor as much of your requests as we can in accordance with our formula. Additionally, like I said, we do have caps on award amounts, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. So if you are a new applicant, meaning you have never received that particular type of ESG funding before, not ESG-CV, that is considered a separate program per our policy. So if you've not received ESG shelter, outreach, or rapid rehousing funds, you're going to see those max amounts listed on the left column. That means that, let's say in the past you had received shelter funding, but you've never applied for rapid rehousing funding, you would still be considered a new applicant for rapid rehousing. Again, because you're operating a new program type, and we want to make sure that you have the capacity to administer those funds Every program is different, as many of you know, and we want to make sure we protect the risk to the agency and to your organization in that. So those shelter amounts are 25,000, rapid rehousing is 100,000, and outreach caps for new applicants are 25,000. You'll note some information within this slide allows you to have some flexibility in what you apply for inside your award, and I'll talk about that in a moment. If you are a returning applicant, meaning you have received shelter funding in the past and you're applying again, the maximum amount of funding you can receive is 60,000. For rapid rehousing, the max is 250,000, and the outreach funds are a maximum of 50,000. So I have some notes here on these slides to give a little bit of detail as far as how that funding can be applied within your application. So within our process at IHCDA, shelter funds can apply for a small rapid rehousing component. The intention of these rapid rehousing funds for shelters, the small component of funding, is to provide a resource to shelters to help rehouse people from the shelter facility. So it's not meant to be a full rapid rehousing program with 12 months of rental assistance and things like that, but it is meant to give participants inside your shelter access to things like utility deposits or rental assistance, short-term rental assistance, maybe a couple of months of rent or a unit deposit or anything like that. So we know how difficult it can be for folks sometimes to save enough money to get out of shelter because it's just the initial expenses that can be so costly. And the intention is by allowing shelters to apply for a small component of rapid rehousing, it gives you a little bit of flexible money within your organization to do some of that. Inside our rapid rehousing awards, we automatically provide a rapid rehousing awards with a 7.5% administrative line. That's the maximum administration funds that can be awarded to an ESG grant. And just know that that 7.5 will be automatically applied within the amount you're requesting. So if you ask for $100,000 in rapid rehousing, if you are awarded funding, when you get your grant agreement, you will automatically see 7.5% in admin. If you were to request later on that you wanted that money moved out, we would be happy to do that through a budget modification, but you're just going to automatically see that 7.5% within that award. It does not going to get added on to the top of that $100,000. Rapid rehousing awards can also apply for HP component. At IHCDA, we do not provide a straight HP only award, though some of our subrecipients include homeless prevention in their award and some choose not to. Again, this is just a way for folks to have flexibility in their award so that they can serve clients in their communities as they see fit. And then that outreach max is 25,000. Because of the eligible expenses under shelter and outreach, we don't at this time include straight admin under those types of awards. So just know that if you're applying for 25,000 and you're not interested in a rapid rehousing award at all, as you can indicate in your application, that would be $25,000 for you to operate your shelter and not a separate line item for admin. Similarly, for our returning folks, it's similar principles. Folks can apply for that small component of rapid rehousing with that intention of using short-term benefit and barrier busting money that can come from the ESG grant. And then for returning applicants in the rapid rehousing component, note that we do have a minimum expectation would receive, apply for $50,000. And again, with the 7.5% administrative line, and so on. And I have a typo on this slide. It shouldn't say 100K. It should say 250K. Because again, the HP would be inclusive of your total $250,000 award. It's not in addition to. And then again, outreach maximum is 50,000. We have a minimum capacity set on that rapid rehousing award, again, just for administrative burden on the organization and on us to be operating the more complex rapid rehousing awards. So just kind of note that that's going to be something that we operate under. A final thing I want to mention, and this is going to be a key difference for those of you who have applied in past years, is you'll note that in the application form, we are not asking you for a detailed budget. That's because at this time, we know because we're going to have more requests than we have available funding for. It didn't seem like it was a good use of folks' time to ask you to complete a detailed, line by line item budget when we were going to have to ask you to go in and completely correct that budget when and if you were awarded funding. So just know that before you contract, we will be getting you a detailed budget if you are selected for funding. It's just that it didn't seem to make sense to ask you and us to do that work twice, since we know that we have so many potential applicants compared to the amount of funding we have available. Very briefly, just want to make sure we are on the same page about who ESG funds are designed to serve. So this information is particularly helpful if your organization has not applied for ESG before and want to make sure that your organization is well positioned to be eligible to utilize these funds. We aren't necessarily going to know from looking at your application a detailed history of your organization and the population you serve. And we know that the experience of homelessness is really varied, and it's not going to necessarily look like what HUD defines as homeless. So what I would hate to do is have anyone apply for this funds, be very excited, and then realize that the people you're serving, you can't actually spend this money on. So this is especially for those of you who are new, and we're just going to really briefly hit on a couple of things. So first, with the exception of homeless prevention funding, emergency solutions grant funds are designed to serve folks who are defined as experiencing homelessness under HUD categories. And HUD has several of those categories. And that is the primary ones that are eligible for ESG are our category 1 households. Those are individuals or families whose primary nighttime residence is easiest way for me to say it is to have somebody who's living in a place not meant for human habitation. The category 4 status is for folks who are fleeing domestic violence. Those are the two primary categories under this grant. This also includes obviously folks sleeping in a shelter. It includes folks in transitional housing. Anybody who'd be considered homeless because of where they're residing are folks who are experiencing homelessness and can be served by the grant. If you are interested in homeless prevention funds, these dollars here can be used for folks who are experiencing what's called category 2 funding. And that category 2 funding means that you are at imminent risk of homelessness, meaning your residence will be lost in 14 days and there's nowhere else for that person to go and they have no other resources identified. So essentially imagine a situation in which myself, I have just received a notice from my landlord that I am being evicted for lack of paying rent. I have nowhere else to go, that I can think of, but I actually have, $30,000 saved in the bank and I just chose not to pay my rent. And that's probably not a good use of homeless prevention funds. So I'm making kind of a ridiculous example just to say that the eligibility of the program is for folks who are unable to access any other resources to pay their rent. And part of what you'd be asked to do if you choose to administer those funds is prove and demonstrate that you are tracking that kind of information. The next thing I want to hit on is data entry and what we call HMIS, for the Homeless Management Information System, as well as coordinated entry. I want to be clear on this because I think there was a lack of clarity on this in the past, or maybe some inconsistency. HMIS is the database system that is used by the Balance of State and any HUD homeless program. And the one we use here at the Balance of State is called Client Track, or DV Client Track. And if you are going to receive a ESG funding, you must use HMIS or DV Client Track. So Client Track or DV Client Track, administered by IHCBA. If you are an applicant who has access to another HMIS system, let's say you have funds that you operate inside Marion County and you're using that HMIS system, we can have a conversation about whether or not it's appropriate for you to continue to utilize that system or to use the Balance of State ones as well. But what I want to be clear on is that if you're going to administer the funds, you have to use HMIS and it needs to be Client Track or DV Client Track. We're not going to accept comparable data systems any longer. So I think in the past there was some inconsistency on that, and I just want to make sure I'm being really clear on that now. Your organization will participate in the point in time count and use the housing inventory chart. You complete the housing inventory chart when that time comes if you are receiving ESG funds. And then finally, coordinated entry. So if you are, again, if you're a new applicant and not familiar, if you are applying for rapid rehousing assistance, your referrals for that assistance should come from the coordinated entry system. And we hope and expect that shelter projects would be helping refer clients to coordinated entry so that they can access homeless housing resources in order for them to successfully exit their programs. This includes projects that serve survivors of domestic violence. If you have concerns about how coordinated entry in your area is operating, or especially as it relates to serving survivors of domestic violence, please reach out to the community services inbox. And I can, that email was at the front end of the presentation. The main key thing I want to make sure we understand is that we want to be connecting people. And if we have problems with CE, that we're addressing those, not that we're not using the system. And then finally, awards are monitored. We are required per our policies to monitor 25% of our programs each year. Anytime you are a first-time awardee, we will monitor you as soon as we possibly can. And we are getting back on track with our monitoring schedule. I do believe by the end of this year, we'll be fully caught up. So if you have not applied for funding before and you receive funding, I would expect to be monitored immediately. And if you maybe were new last year, I would expect that if you haven't gotten monitoring done already, you're going to get one done this year. Monitoring reviews federal compliance. It will involve a case file review. It will look at your HMIS data records and coordinated entry referrals. It will make sure that your match and financial documentations are correct. They're pretty in-depth, but they're important for us to ensure compliance with the grant. All right. Finally, that these funds can be used for an applicant, for any applicants who serve special populations. If you are somebody who serves a survivor of domestic violence and you see terminology like victim services, or you don't know what that term is as you look at any of our materials or any of our application, I've tried to take out victim from all of our language, but there was a lot of paperwork to get through. So tried to primarily rephrase that language. But if you aren't familiar with these terms, just know that victim services are those agencies we generally qualify as domestic violence serving. And we are happy to support applications from agencies that only serve particular subpopulations of those who are experiencing homelessness, like youth and young adults, individuals living with HIV or AIDS, veterans, families, adults. We are happy to take applications from all of those types. So now we're going to go into an online application review, and I see from a couple folks that you'd like to see a copy of the RFP put online. Happy to do that. It's going to look a little messy because of the format we're using, but I'll go ahead and download a copy of it and ask our marketing and communications team to post that as soon as possible. But I'll go ahead and pull up our application. We're going to walk through this, and I'm going to just stop sharing and reshare. Make sure you can actually see what we're looking at. Before I get into, I'm just going to make sure there's not any other initial questions. Yeah. Okay, great. I'll answer some of these questions here as we look through this application and make sure we've got what we need. All right, so the front page of the ESG application is one you should be pretty familiar with. If you've completed a grant application before, we just want to know who you are and what you do. The application is written so that there are very few required completed fields. It may be that if you accidentally skip something, you are sent back, and maybe that you won't. Nothing that you skip is something that we can't move forward without, if that makes sense. So what I didn't want to do is force people to complete 1,000 pieces of information. If you've clicked this, I don't need you to click all of them, for example. But I wanted to make sure we streamlined this enough so that we got the absolute pieces of information we needed for you to complete your application. The one main question we're going to want to know from you on this main page is whether or not your agency has any unresolved findings with us or with HUD, or if you have had any funding taken from your organization from a state or federal entity because of noncompliance. This does not mean we can't award you funding. This just means that we need to know that information before we move forward so that we can manage risk and make sure that if there is something going on, that we address it sooner rather than later. And that will allow you to answer that question. I'm not going through that. I'm not going to go through and write actual answers. I think you know, we're just going to click through and look at this at a macro level, if you will. And then the next main thing we're going to want to know is, are you new or are you returning? If you are a new applicant to ESG, you will be asked more questions in more detail than if you are a returning applicant to ESG. We understand that many of our subrecipients have been receiving funding for a long time. And there's pieces of information, again, from you all that we have already, so we don't need to maybe ask some of those questions because we already have those details. If you are a new applicant, you're going to be asked some threshold related questions. Some of these questions are repeated for returning applicants. Some of them are not because they are distinct to new applicants. If we've given you funding before, we already know you're a 501c3, so we're not going to ask you that question. We already know that you're located in the Valence Estate, so we're not going to ask you that question, that kind of thing. We are going to ask everybody questions about whether or not they have fidelity to Housing First, whether or not they are making accommodations for individuals with disabilities, including those who have limited English proficiency and have operating on non-discrimination policy within your organization. We are also asking our new to verify that they can meet match, that they will be utilizing Client Track or DD Client Track, and that you will be committed to preventing and not utilizing the practice of family separation. If you are a new applicant, you are going to have more questions about your federal experience with funds and how you practice your accounting principles. Many of these questions are asked for our returning applicants, but generally we ask a couple of more questions here. And then you'll be asked to upload some materials. You'll be asked to verify that you did attend or not attend your RPC meetings, because we know some people might, some people might not. Okay, thanks. Amanda and guys, I'll take a look at that in a second. And then you'll also be asked to, as a new application, articles of incorporation, fidelity bond insurance, general liability documentation, your SAM.gov registration, and then your match commitment documentation. Because we are asking folks to use a single application for all of the types of funding you're applying for, this means that you only have to complete a lot of this information one time. So if in the past you have applied for rapid rehousing, street outreach, and shelter, or rapid rehousing and shelter, and you've completed entire sections that are identical to each other twice, you're only going to do this once now, which is a plus. But it also means that when we ask for things like a copy of your match, it'd be best if you provide us a copy of the match documentation for all of the money you're applying for. I would suggest you either consolidate your PDFs so that you save your documents as a single PDF to upload, or that you only utilize your match documentation that would cover the entire award if you had some sort of in-kind MOU going on or something like that that's eligible under multiple lines. So if you're a returning applicant, we're going to ask you some of the same questions to make sure you're still utilizing these same principles. And in particular, we want to know whether or not your organization has unspent funding. It's very important that we don't have unspent funds in ESG. We want to make sure that there is not a lack of spend in this award, because when money goes unspent, we get findings with HUD, and we don't like those. If you are a returning applicant, you'll notice we don't ask the Regional Planning Council question here, because we're just going to go ahead and verify that directly with the Regional Planning Council chair. We will be asking questions related to whether or not you are preventing family separation inside your shelter. Are you we do have the Regional Planning Council question here. Sorry, I just reordered them. Whether or not you're participating in PIT and HIC. Have you utilized coordinated entry? Do you have timely data entry? And then again, Secretary of State, fidelity bond insurance, general. So I know that there's a couple of questions about in the past being required to put a lot of additional documentation into your application. What we're going to be doing now, because again, we have some of that documentation already, because some of you receive funding from other funding streams like COC. So we know that you have a homeless representative on your board. And we don't need to ask it here. So we're going to be collecting things from other programs and documenting that as a part of your compliance with this program. As well as collecting certain pieces of information prior to contracting with your organization. So in the past, if you had to provide a fire marshal inspection document for your shelter, we would just ask for that information later, as opposed to asking for it now. This is really because of our lack of staff capacity right now. Having Diane leave means that we don't have anybody who's going to be able to look at every single piece of paper right today. So just trying to be reasonable about our expectations. And not rely on that piece of paper, at this date, knowing that you can attain that at a later date. Inside the RFP, it talks about all of these pieces of documentation. It's still because at some point we are going to require many of these pieces of information from you. Again, whether or not we get them from you because you are with another program like COC, and so we have your board representation or your board documentation, or whether or not we have, to reach out to you at a later date and get that inspection. Oh, thanks. Thanks for letting me know that, Melissa. That's a mistake. I just need to finish. I tried to go in and fix something, and I think I made it confusing. So I'll go ahead and fix that. I'll go ahead and fix it today. Regarding the submit button, I know that says submit, it won't submit. I just tried to fix something and apparently I edited the wrong page, or it just edited all the pages for me. All right, so everybody, regardless of new or returning applicants, are asked information about your board of directors and how often you meet, whether or not there's someone on your board with lived experience, what kind of service coordination you do with other types of organizations, whether or not you engage with the VA. Are you working with a PATH program? Do you work ever with survivors or victims of sexual assault and domestic violence? Are you working with housing choice voucher programs? All those kinds of things are part of what we will ask you on this page. And, if you're an organization that partners heavily with other people, you get lots of points for all of these kinds of things. So that's really nice for your program that you do those things, and we want to give you credit for those things. So again, whether or not you're new or returning, these are all questions that you are asked regardless. If your organization already receives any ESG funds from an entitlement city, so, Fort Wayne receives their own ESG allocation, Gary, Indiana does, Evansville does, we just want to know that. It does not prohibit you from receiving funding from us. It just means that we want to make sure we know that you're doing that. And again, as a reminder, you can't use your city ESG dollars to match your IHCDA ESG award, and vice versa. We wouldn't want you using your IHCDA to match with any other ESG funding you receive. And then finally, you'll have a request for ESG funding that you're applying for, and you'll be able to have shelter, rapid housing, or outreach. I see what you mean. That's frustrating that frustrating. I was trying to edit just one page and it edited the whole document. So thank you guys for letting me know that. I didn't realize that happened. Okay. Now we get into shelter. So if you are a shelter applicant, whether new or returning, you're going to answer all of these page questions about shelter. Are you going to make sure folks are experiencing literal homelessness when they enter your shelter? Are you working on a case management and a housing plan with folks? Are you partnering with schools and those McKinney-Vento liaisons in your school districts so that children within your shelter are receiving educational services adequately? And then we want to know whether or not you've received ESG in the past. Again, ESG funding for shelter, not COVID money for shelter, ESG money for shelter previously. And again, this means from us, not from a city. So this is our part of trying to figure out, are you a new applicant to this funding or a returning applicant? So if you are a new applicant to shelter, your maximum request is $25,000. You'll notice the only way we could get this question to work is so that we got dollar amounts put in here, was to just let you put a raw number. So no commas, no dollar signs. It reads that way on the application, but just to clarify, if you try and type in $25,000 with a comma or a dollar sign, it's going to bump it back to you and say, I don't know what this number is. Appreciate your cooperation with that. That will make it much easier for us going through the scoring process and then going into the allocation process, because everyone's numbers will be formatted the same and we won't have to reformat anybody's application to reflect the amount of money they're asking for. Clients you're planning to serve, is this application operating for an overnight or a day shelter? If you do both, please indicate that you're applying as an overnight shelter. I know people can do both, but we want to, if something is being used only for day sheltering, then we just want to note that. Current sources of funding. Again, that's just something we are listing out for everybody. And then, are you going to be operating a rapid rehousing program with your shelter award? If you are, how much money will be a part of that? So just again, as an example, if you're applying for $25,000 and you list here that you want $25,000 in rapid rehousing, that means you want $0 in your actual shelter. So we're probably going to be emailing you back and saying, I think you wrote this in wrong. Again, the maximum award is $25,000 for new applicants. So that means that when you put in whatever amount you'd like to have for your small rapid rehousing award, that you're thinking about it $25,000 minus whatever you want for your shelter award. So if you want $20,000 for your shelter award, then you'd have $5,000 left over for that rapid rehousing award. Then if you are an applicant here and you are only applying for shelter, then you'd select this box. If you're going to be applying for shelter and rapid rehousing, so not just the small rapid rehousing award within the shelter award, a separate rapid rehousing award where you'd have those different maximums and minimums for applying, you'd select this one. I am applying for shelter and outreach. And then I'm going to apply for all types of ESG. So we have people who do all of this, and I just need to know, in order to map you through the application, what you're planning on applying for. If you're only applying for shelter, you'd hit that button and it would take you to the very end of the application and you would be complete. You'd have a couple more questions to answer, but you'd pretty much be done. But if you're going to apply for any more of these funds, then you'd answer that question and receive those additional dollars. Excuse me, receive those additional questions to ask for your additional dollars. All right. If you are a returning shelter applicant, we are really only going to ask you about how much you're asking for, whether or not you're changing anything about what you're doing, and whether or not you want that rapid rehousing award. So we want to be able to document, if you're changing your service area, if you're going to add counties, maybe you're contracting as an organization, so you need to serve fewer counties. That's information we're going to ask you to report here as a returning applicant. If you're a new applicant, these questions wouldn't apply to you. The application will skip these questions. And then similarly, are you only applying for shelter? Are you going to apply for shelter in some other award? Are you going to apply for all three? And you'll be asked those questions, which will then map you to the next part of the application. So if you are applying for rapid rehousing, whether you're a new or returning applicant, you're going to be asked all of these questions, very similar to shelter questions. We want to make sure that you are providing case management that's focused on housing services and stability. We want to make sure that you are aware and able to comply with HUD's lead-based paint requirement. I can tell you right now, we have been monitored for every program that we receive in my department in the last year, all of them. It's been fun. And every single one of them has asked us very specific about lead-based paint. So there's somebody at HUD who's very excited about lead-based paint this year, and we're going to have to make sure everybody's super compliant on it. We're actually going to host some training later this year on it. So want to make sure you're prepared for that. Again, coordinating with McKinney-Ventos. Are you going to utilize the Go Section 8 software, which I know has a new name now? I apologize that application has a weird written question, but that is the system we use for determining rent reasonableness, which is a part of operating the program. And again, if you've done this before, you know that, but if you don't, you don't. Are you going to have landlord strategies, work on mediation with landlords and utility companies? We want to make sure you're going to operate a good rapid rehousing program with lots of services and complementary services like mediation and things like that. Want to make sure that, again, particularly in rapid rehousing, that we are really reinforcing the housing first principles, that you are working to stabilize income, and then again, asking about whether or not you've received ESG before. And again, if you haven't, it's going to look very similar. You know, what is the request you're making? What are your current funding sources for your organization and your program? And where you're planning to serve, and then whether or not you want a homeless prevention portion of your award. And if you do, again, since this is for a new applicant, that 7.5% admin will automatically be applied. So 7.5 of 100,000, for example, would be $7,500 automatically going to be held for admin in your award. And then how much of that $100,000 are you asking for to be homeless prevention funds? And again, apologies, I just need it to be a raw number, no commas or dollar signs in that number. And again, it's going to ask you whether or not you're applying for anything else. If you're a returning applicant, very similar as before under shelter, you obviously have a higher amount you can request because you've received funding previously, but we just want to know, are you changing anything about what you've done? If you're not changing anything, you can say no, you can, you can basically, move pretty quickly through this portion of the application. Also, are you applying for HP funds? Again, want to make sure you're being cognizant not to put in the dollar signs or the commas. And are you applying for anything else? The last section is our street outreach program. So again, are you serving folks who experience little or homelessness? Is your program going to connect people with housing resources and permanent housing? And have you received outreach funds from IHCDA previously? So if you haven't, you're going to be asked, again, a very similar series of questions about your program and what you're planning to do with the funding and who you're going to, or how many people are going to serve with that. If you're a returning applicant, you're going to have this very similar series of questions. Did you change anything about your program? Are you going to operate at the same? And then move on to the next section. This is really the last page. So if you get to this point, this is the last page, which is the page I thought I edited yesterday. I thought I was just editing submit here because I had 4 emails over the weekend from people who didn't realize that this was the last page, and I was trying to find a way to better indicate that. So thank you to you guys for giving me a heads up. And I'm just gonna hit save. We'll just deal with that little piece there. So the reason why this isn't actually the last page is that it is possible, and this would be particularly true for new applicants. If you're a returning applicant and you end up on this page, you definitely want to reach out to me immediately. If you are ending up here, this is because you've selected an option inside the application which makes your organization or your project ineligible for funding. So if you've perhaps indicated that you will not use HMIS, we're going to bump you out of the application and send you to this page, which I hope will then prompt an email to our community services inbox so we can have a conversation with you about just kind of realigning expectations or making sure we understand each other. Or maybe it's a realization on your part after reviewing the application materials that you're not eligible. That request for proposal, is really a true request for proposal, kind of old school style. So we know that looking at that versus looking at this does feel different. And maybe when you look at that, you feel like you align, but as you start to answer some of these questions, you don't. And we want to pop people out of the application to start an immediate conversation with them if there's something wrong. It's not to say that, we can't have a conversation and then you could go reapply, but the application will still be due July 3rd. So what you will see from me coming after this, guys, is I will go ahead and create a PDF of this document and I'll get it over to our marketing and communications team. And you should probably see that up this afternoon, if not sooner. But, the application itself, if you're applying for COC right now, it's a much different application than COC. It's pretty straightforward generally, but just know you are going to want to have these materials when you go to apply, because, this format is how it's going to ask for those attachments and you're going to want to be able to provide those. So as a reminder, I'll go ahead and scroll back up to what those were. But scroll, right? Okay. So we're going to want to make sure if you are a returning applicant that you have your Secretary of State registration. This returning applications are going to need their Fidelity bond insurance, their liability insurance, and their SAM.gov commitment. If you're a new applicant, meaning you have not ever received any ESG funds from us, including CV, not including CV. So if you got CV, You still need to select that you're a new applicant for this. And this is at all, right? This is at the front end of the application. We're going to need all of those things again. You know, we're going to need that Secretary of State. We're going to need your article. We're going to need your bond insurance, general liability insurance, SAM.gov registration, and your match letter. And then we're also going to need your articles of incorporation. So that is for new applicants. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and hit on a couple of things. Please, thank you so much for that feedback about wanting the full application. Happy to provide that to you all. And we'll get that on the website as soon as we can. So we have reviewed the online application, and now we're just going to hit on a couple of things before we wrap up today. And I'm happy to spend as much or as little time on any of these as folks want to. And I'll go through questions here in a moment once we wrap up. So a couple of components, overviews, and reminders. So I think the application tried to detail, but I just want to be very clear. ESG can fund emergency shelter, which is inclusive of overnight or day shelter services. It can fund rapid rehousing and homeless prevention. At IHCDA, we group those applications together. So if you're applying for rapid rehousing, you have the opportunity to apply for HP. We do not have HP only, homeless prevention only programs that we operate out of our ESG program. And then we have street outreach. These programs can serve special populations. So if you only serve folks who are HIV/AIDS, you can apply for ESG funding. If you only serve survivors of domestic violence, you can apply for ESG funding. Same with veterans. You know, you're still eligible to apply for ESG. You want to closely review those requests for proposals that are going to really in detail go through what the eligible expenses are under the application. And as I said earlier, the reason we're just asking for you to give us a whole dollar amount is that we know that we're going to have more requests for funding than we have available funds. And as a formula grant, what we do is we take that total amount that everybody requested, and then using our formula, everybody who was eligible that requested funding, we put that into a calculation, and your request is resized to fit the amount of money we have in that pool of funding. So it just seemed to make more sense for us to just ask you for that total amount and then get a budget detail once we tell you how much you're going to get. Because, you know, maybe when you thought you were going to get $250,000 in rapid rehousing, you imagined one budget, but when we tell you it's only going to be $160,000, you reimagine that budget quite significantly. So we're only going to have you do that budget detail one time, as opposed to trying to do it multiple times and not having you get what you would initially requested and have to do that budget again. But because of that, we just want to make sure, especially those of you who are new, that what you want is eligible, you know, under the grant. What you're applying for, you understand what you're applying for, it's eligible, and all of those kinds of things. So some next steps, like I said, closely review that RFP, take a look at that information, and make sure you understand it, especially if you're new. Make sure you know what the eligible expenses are. So as you're envisioning the budget requests you're going to make, if you're going to ask, for example, for that full $25,000 request as a new shelter applicant, that you're aware of what you can spend that money on. So you know you could spend that down, and be prepared for that. Applications are due on July 3rd. We need those to be submitted online, and that all of your materials are going to be in a single application. Now, let's say you make a horrible mistake and you accidentally forget to add one attachment to your application. You can email that to the community services inbox, and we'll work with you on, you know, making sure that that information is attached to your application. It's I understand that you know, mistakes can happen. You know, I don't want you to feel like you shouldn't submit, or if you don't follow up with an email to us, we may look at your application, see that something is missing, and then just think you're ineligible because you didn't give us that piece of information. So it's better for you to reach out to us via email and get us that next step if you happen to have forgotten something. Please don't rely on that as a way to do your application without maybe having all of your materials, because as I said, we usually have one, if not two other folks working on this program. And right now we only have me. So it's the more extra things we put in, the longer this takes. And for those of you who've done this in the past, you know that it can take a long time for us to get this money out the door to you. So my hope is by using this particular format, and I know that we've had ESG applications like the last couple of years come at you at every sort of, you know, format. We've had PDF, JotForm, now this. I'm hoping that the way this is structured and the way that SurveyMonkey operates in comparison with JotForm will allow us to very quickly review applications and score them so that we can get this funding approved by our IHCDA board, which has to approve the allocations before we can distribute them to you and let you know how much money you got. My hope is that we have that done by the end of August so that as soon as that money hits our account at IHCDA, we're able to do that in hopefully September. So in the past, sometimes this has gone as late as November. And it's really just about, you know, if it takes us longer to get through the applications, then all this timeline gets pushed out. So we really want to make sure we get this out to you as quickly as we can. I'm going to go ahead and go back through the chat questions and see what we got. I can, if people want to, walk through a very detailed version of what is eligible under the grant, but many of you folks are not new, so I did not want to do that if we didn't need to. All right, I'm going to scroll to the top here. Rapid rehousing expenses don't cover client arrears. It's the homeless prevention funding that would cover those arrears. So if you are wanting to pay for past due rent in your rapid rehousing program, let's say you get somebody enrolled in your program and they say, yeah, I'd love to move in, but I owe this landlord $1,200 and nobody's gonna want to rent me if I still have this on my record, or I've got a judgment or something like that. You can use it to pay up to 6 months of rental arrears. And that's where the homeless prevention funding comes in there. So you would want to make sure that if you were interested in that you indicate in your application that you'd like some homeless prevention funding. And that will make sure that we account for that in our allocation decision. I will go ahead and get a blank application on the website. Yes, so in the past, we've asked you to complete some additional forms. We're not asking you to complete this year. So in the past, we've asked you to have a document signed by your regional planning council chair. And what we're going to do instead this year is for all returning applicants and new applicants, we're going to provide that list per each regional planning council chair, and they'll indicate who's participated. If you're a new applicant and you have not engaged with that regional planning council yet, it's not a deal breaker. We're just going to need to talk to regional planning council chair, get you connected and move that process forward so that you are connected in the future. Yes, Melissa, thanks for throwing that up to me. And I think somebody else pointed that out too. So I think we've got that fixed now and it's not going to say submit. All right, yes, we will get the PDF version of the document. Yes, I know you all know what's through here. Oh, sure. Thanks, Kay. Hi, Kay. Yeah, so what is the grant term? Thank you. That was a really big miss on my side of things. Thank you so much for bringing this up. So we get our applications out now, and then we award funding, like I said, kind of in that time frame of we hope making an announcement in August, early September. And then what we'll do is get awards out, your grant agreements out in hopefully September, October. What that grant agreement will be will let you go and claim all the way back to July 1st, because that is the operating time period. It'll go July 1st to June 30 of 2020, July 1st, 2023 to June 30, 2024. And that will be the term of that grant agreement. If you are, those of you who've done this a while, this is where I'm not going to get too heavy into detail. You know that we have folks who will not expend all of their funding, and then we are able to do a reallocation of funds. So if you do not spend your full award in that July 1 to June 30 timeframe, that's not funding you get to keep, and we're not going to issue a grant agreement. We will pull that money back and then reallocate it out to partners who had demonstrated the capacity to spend. All of that to say is if you get to that process with us and you are having difficulty spending your money, we provide lots of TA and support. Even the small but mighty team that we are more than happy to provide you that support. Can rapid rehousing dollars be used to pay? Ooh, okay, so if you own the property, if you are the property owner, I will have to look up at regulation to make sure. So if you're owning a property and you have you want to operate a rapid rehousing program, ESG is really not the program to do that with. Continuum of care funding looks a little bit different and can I know for sure that having payments be to yourself as the landlord is, if not an allowable in ESG, very complicated in ESG. So Craig, I'll get back to you and let you know what the exact regulation is. But if you are interested in being an owner and an operator of a program and building, then you may want to take a look at continuum of care funding, because that those program types will look a little bit more amenable to that kind of model as opposed to ESG, which is much more in comparison with COC has, really only the options of fairly shallow subsidies in the rapid rehousing program in comparison. Other questions? Yes. Okay. So yeah, thanks, Bill. Hi. See, Bill. Okay. Hi, guys. Yes. So we, in the past, we had been operating ESG, with a model that you had 60 days to draw a claim from the end of, the date. So let's say you had your, January 2023 claims. We were providing people up to 60 days to file that, that January claim, meaning January 31st, and then 60 days after that. We started running into significant difficulties with people pushing that 60 days into 75 days and into 80 days. And then when we went to go close out, we had money unaccounted for because people had gotten, and especially with COVID, it was just so hard, right? So we had to really pull that deadline in to account for the fact that we have some folks who, even though 60 days seems like more time, process. So our expectation now is, and you will see this if you are awarded funding, your grant agreement will say that you have 30 days to file a claim for the previous month. So your, January 2023 claims, we're going to want to see a claim for January and I think the language will be by the last day of the following month. So by February 28th or 29th, and February 28th, 29th come around, we're going to want to see it by January or March 30 or 31st. Probably just depend on the day, or the length of the month, right? We had to do that for administrative purposes. So I know that's a change for folks. We started that last year by issuing some guidance about it, but that will be a part of our implementation this year. Thanks, Bill. Any other questions? Any questions about program components? Happy to go. If anybody doesn't understand eligible expenses under a certain line, happy to go through any of those and better clarify them. Yeah, Melissa, so we're going to go ahead. Our timeline for most of this usually turns around in a couple of days. I'll be able to download this file and get it over to our marketing and communications team today. I would assume this will probably be posted by Thursday or Friday of this week. We'll send out a reminder to everyone that the applications are due, and we'll include a copy of this video, website link and things like that for people to access. It'll be a YouTube video, so. Thanks, Andrea. Yes, unfortunately, this format only allows you to go through and submit it at the end. You can't go back in and access it. What I can say is that we are in the process of migrating to a new grants management system, and that new system will have that capability. Unfortunately, our developers weren't ready to launch it yet for ESG, and our priority was to get the money out the door to you all as quickly as possible and not wait for that much more snazzy application tool, but I'm excited to say that it's coming. We're going to have it next year, but that's a really great question. Yes. Hi, Sierra. Yes. So you guys do operate multiple programs. You will submit a single application. So as you go through, you'll complete that rapid rehousing section. Then you'll indicate, I'd like to apply for a rapid rehousing award. So you'll actually skip all those shelter questions. If you were going to indicate like, oh, I'm going to apply for rapid rehousing, then it would skip over that shelter section. Sure. And then you would want to make sure that when you're submitting your application that your match commitment was inclusive of your your rapid rehousing and your outreach award, as best as you can. If you make a mistake, obviously reach out to us. We understand that. And then each of those award pots are separate. So $250,000 is $250,000 for rapid rehousing. 50,000 is 50,000 for outreach. So you could, in a beautiful world, you could receive $300,000, 250 in rapid rehousing HP, and 50,000 in outreach. So they are, oh, it's okay, yeah, they are distinct. It's not that if you applied for $50,000 in outreach, we'd right size your rapid rehousing quest and take out that 50. So that's a good question. Okay, so moving kits, Chelsea, that's a great question. I'm gonna try and see if I can find an answer to that in this presentation. So generally, when I think of move-in kits, I think of supplies needed when somebody moves in, but not everything might be eligible that you might think of in a move-in kit. So let's see if we have any guidance in here to give us. I'm assuming probably not, but we'll see. I'm clicking through this because I'm assuming you guys notice you know a lot of this information already, but if you see something and you want me to move back, I can. Moving costs are specified here in our RFP, and we have moving cost information in here. So that would include something like renting a truck or hiring a moving company. I actually know one of our partners was using this as match. They had a moving company that was donating their moving team to move people. So that was an interesting way to get matched. When I would think of a move-in kit that would be eligible under a rapid rehousing program, I would think that that would include things that would be necessary to move into a home and settle. I would need to look at the specific regulation on what items could or could not be counted. What I would not put in a move-in kit, if you were going to talk about whether or not you were billing this to the grant or not, I would not put in a gift card. Gift cards are rarely considered match or eligible for expenditures in a program. So a gas card or $5 to or $25 to Kroger, not going to be eligible for a program, because what that person might use that $25 on may or may not be relevant to their moving in process, right? So gift cards are just always hard. So I would not put gift cards in there. I wouldn't put anything in there that was gift cards would probably be my only thing I'd be definitely worried about. Definitely not including gift cards. And I'd have to look at how people have used and what specifically regulation says about move-in baskets, just because I'm less familiar with what's eligible under ESG, and I think it's probably more flexible than COC, but I don't want to speak too heavily on it. But definitely not gift cards. That's my answer on that. I'm sorry, I'm not more detailed. I'm still learning this program quite a bit. Yeah, I've got like 70 slides I could go all the way through for you, but like I said, I was really kind of trying to prevent having you to, listen to like a real deep dive on ESG administration. Oh yeah, and that's a great question, Chelsea. So I'll definitely do some research, because I'm sure there's lots of programs that would use moving kits, either with their program funding or as match, because those are, how many times do we move people in and they have nothing, right? They don't have laundry detergent, they don't have a broom, all those kinds of things. And it may be that move-in kits might be eligible under, like, if you were operating a shelter grant versus a rapid housing grant, because again, shelter stuff that you would use in operating a shelter would be different than what you would use in what are eligible lines under rapid housing. So that might also be a component of why they're using that term for move-in kits. What else? Any other questions? So while I have you all on the line, if you are not familiar with an upcoming training we have, I strongly encourage you to attend. I'll actually drop the link for it here in our chat. This week, we're going to be hosting a training on the HUD equal access rule. We are going to be recording that session, but I am really, excuse me, not this week. It's, I think it's next week. I'm really, really excited about this because, yeah, it's next week, the 29th. We actually have the woman who rewrote the HUD regulations after 2021. She's actually doing this training for us. So she is extremely knowledgeable on HUD equal access rule. And if you've never heard the term equal access rule, this is how we prevent discrimination of individuals who are LGBTQ+, along with all sorts of other protected classes of individuals, to make sure that they have equal access to shelter and resources, and that, they're not facing discrimination, which is, obviously a high priority for HUD, always to prevent discriminatory practices in housing. So, yeah, I'm really excited about that training. I hope you can attend. If you aren't able to, we will record it, but it should be a really awesome session. It is, obviously a big part of operating a HUD program is that you're complying with something like equal access. Last reminder I'll send is that if you are somebody who receives ESG-CV funding and you just received an additional grant award for primarily shelter, though we had a couple of rapid rehousing ones that were hanging out there that we had to reissue. We are having office hours on Monday, the 26th next week. If you are a regular ESG recipient already, you may think, hey, isn't that the time we usually have ESG office hours for us? We're not going to do regular ESG office hours this month. We're just going to have this special COVID CV session. If you have previously received ESG CV and you are not under a current grant agreement or haven't gotten any new grant agreement funding, we're not going to have a session for you until next month. We're going to check in with those of you who have closed out, just make sure we're all good to go. It's obviously been a wild couple of years in operating these programs, and so we want to make sure we've got got your back and you know what you need to do. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. I'll be on for a couple of minutes here if anybody wants to ask additional questions. But again, appreciate your time. We'll get that new application PDF up on the website, and a copy of this recording definitely up there by the end of this week. I hope you all have a great day, and don't hesitate to reach out to us at the community services inbox if you have any questions.